The public humiliation and hook promise. I am rejecting this thesis. Professor Cedric Haleworth dropped Soraya Mensah's bound dissertation onto the table 10 minutes before her defense and told her the room would not open. When Professor Mirek Solano objected that one examiner could not cancel a defense alone, Haleworth escalated. This thesis does not belong in a serious economics department. Then he questioned whether Soraya had written its strongest theory herself. Soraya did not raise her voice. Professor, do you want that authorship concern entered into the official record before the committee reads my co-author disclosure? Haleworth smiled. No serious economist would attach their name to this activist paperwork. He did not know the disclosure already on file documented an outside co-author whose reputation could not be dismissed so easily. If Haleworth forced his accusation into the record without reading it, the issue would no longer be only Soraya's defense. It could become whether he should remain an examiner at all. At 8:50 that Tuesday morning, the electronic board outside Aldenbrook University's Department of Economics showed one defense: Soraya Mensah. After the storm, predicting housing displacement in vulnerable urban communities. Defense time, 9 o'clock. Soraya stood beneath it with a dark blue copy of the dissertation against her side. 6 years of work sat inside. Data from 42 cities. Rent changes, eviction filings, flood exposure, insurance coverage, household credit, zoning, and disaster assistance. The model asked a question Soraya considered painfully simple. Why did some neighborhoods survive a disaster while others lost the people who had lived there before it? Leatrice Wynn stepped from the seminar room carrying the replication laptop. Backup is loaded. Maps? Loaded. Leatrice studied her. You slept? Enough. That means no. Professor Mirek Solano approached with the defense packet. External examiner confirmed. Full committee. We start at 9. Soraya looked toward the closed room. Haleworth. Inside. Cedric Haleworth had spent almost 3 decades calling himself a guardian of rigor. Soraya had learned what that meant in practice. Research on markets was structural. Research on poor renters was advocacy. Community relevance was something her work had to defend before anyone discussed the model itself. His language was rarely explicit enough to challenge cleanly. It still shaped the room. At 8:52, Haleworth walked into the hallway carrying her dissertation. He placed it on the narrow table. I am rejecting this thesis. Soraya first assumed he meant he would vote against it after examination. Then he reached toward the seminar room door. The defense should not proceed. Solano stepped between him and the handle. Cedric, that decision belongs to the committee. I am not legitimizing a document that fails our standard. Then question it inside. There is no value in staging a defense for work that should never have reached this point. 2 graduate students slowed near the stairs. A department coordinator stopped beside the printer. Haleworth had chosen a public hallway. Soraya understood the purpose. Doubt first, evidence later. What is the specific defect, she asked. The theoretical chapter is politically motivated and inconsistent with the level of scholarship I have observed from you. Which claim is wrong? This is not a line edit. Which assumption is wrong? You are proving my point. You treat criticism as opposition to your cause. Soraya kept her voice level. Then identify the academic problem. Haleworth opened Chapter 3. Red marks crowded the margins. This section suddenly acquires a level of institutional theory absent from your earlier departmental work. Leatrice looked up. Soraya asked, are you questioning the chapter or my authorship? I am questioning credibility. Those are different questions. Not always. The hallway went quiet. Leatrice said, are you saying she did not write it? Haleworth ignored her. The voice does not match the scholar I have observed. Heat rose beneath Soraya's collar. She had rebuilt the model when strong results collapsed on incomplete neighborhood data. Haleworth had reduced years of that work to a voice he did not believe belonged to her. Please state the concern precisely. I do not owe you courtroom language. No, But if you are stopping my defense because you question authorship, I want the record to say that." Solano looked at him. Hailworth could have stepped back. Instead, he said, "I have concerns that portions of this dissertation may not represent the candidate's independent scholarly capacity." Soraya nodded once. "Please preserve that wording." Hailworth gave a thin smile. "You seem confident for someone whose defense is about to be postponed." "I submitted the authorship disclosures Aldenbrook requires." A small pause. "What disclosures?" Soraya saw the missing fact. Chapter 3 is based on a published co-authored paper. Hailworth laughed. "With whom? Another policy advocate?" Solano cut in. "You should have read the submission packet. The identity of a collaborator does not rescue weak scholarship." "I agree," Soraya said. "That is why the contribution statement matters more than the name." Hailworth mistook her answer for retreat. "It will not change my assessment." 3 weeks earlier, Soraya had filed the dissertation by publication declaration through Aldenbrook's graduate portal. Chapter 3 was identified as collaborative work. She was listed as lead author for the model, data, and primary analysis, with the outside scholar's contribution separated in a signed letter. Soraya had followed the process because collaboration invited legitimate questions. She had not expected an examiner to accuse her before reading the answer. At 8:57, Orrin Belcastle, the graduate academic secretary, arrived with a tablet after Solano contacted him. "I understand there is a request to halt the defense." "There is," Hailworth said. "On what basis?" "Academic integrity and scholarly standard." Orrin's tone changed. "Academic integrity meaning plagiarism, undisclosed authorship, fabrication, or another defined concern. Do not reduce academic judgment to a checklist. If a scheduled defense is being stopped for integrity, the category determines the process." Hailworth looked irritated. "The theoretical chapter appears inconsistent with the candidate's demonstrated level of independent scholarship." "So there is an authorship concern. There is a credibility concern. I need a category." Hailworth exhaled. "Potential undisclosed contribution." Soraya felt the situation shift. He had made the accusation formal enough to test. Orrin looked at her. "Did you submit a co-author declaration?" "Yes." "For that chapter?" "Yes." "When?" "With my final dissertation packet 3 weeks ago." Orrin searched the portal. "Submission received." Hailworth leaned closer. Orrin continued. "Co-author disclosure received. Publication clearance received. External contribution letter received." Solano stared at Hailworth. "You had access to this." Hailworth hardened. "I did not say there was no paperwork. I said the work does not meet the standard." Orrin replied, "Those are now 2 separate matters. Academic quality could be examined. So could the authorship concern Hailworth had just placed into the record. They could not be treated as the same accusation." At 9:03, the defense was delayed and Dean Helena Morrowind was notified because a senior examiner was trying to halt it on an integrity ground. "Why is graduate studies involved?" Hailworth asked. "Because an authorship allegation used to stop a doctoral defense requires review," Orrin said. Hailworth looked at Soraya. "You have turned a scholarly concern into an administrative spectacle." Solano answered, "You raised it in a hallway 10 minutes before her defense." At 9:11, Dean Morrowind arrived. She asked for the documented sequence, not opinions. Orrin gave it. Scheduled defense. Examiner requests halt. Authorship concern entered. Candidate states prior disclosure. Portal confirms the required documents were filed. Morrowind looked at Hailworth. "Did you read the co-author declaration?" "I read the thesis. That was not my question." "No." "The external contribution letter?" "No." "Then this thesis will not be rejected for an undisclosed contribution before we read the disclosure that was already disclosed." Hailworth crossed his arms. "Administrative paperwork is now overruling academic standards." "No, the academic question remains. I am preventing an allegation from becoming a decision before the supporting record is opened. Soraya asked, "Will the defense proceed?" Not at 9:15. Her stomach dropped. Morrowind continued. "We review the integrity concern first. If there is no basis for a hold, we determine the earliest valid time the full committee can proceed." Hailworth had not ended the defense. He had delayed it. The external examiner had another commitment that afternoon, and Soraya's postdoctoral application required degree confirmation before the end of the month. A false concern did not need to survive forever to hurt her. It only needed time. At 9:20, the hallway emptied. Leatrice went inside with Oren to verify the replication archive. Solano followed Morrowind. Soraya remained beside the table where Hailworth had dropped her dissertation. She picked it up. One corner of the blue cover was bent. That small crease hurt more than it should have. Her phone showed a message from her mother. How did it go? Soraya stared at it. For 1 minute, she wanted to take the elevator down and walk out of Aldenbrook. Then she remembered the apartment complex beside the Evers River where she had lived at 14. Floodwater entered the buildings and disappeared days later. The real displacement came afterward. Repairs became rent increases. Delayed assistance became eviction notices. Investors bought damaged units. Families vanished one lease at a time. Her mother had said, "The storm puts water in the house. The system decides who can afford to come back." Soraya ran her thumb over the bent cover. She had not spent 6 years measuring how systems pushed people out, so one professor could push her out with an assumption he refused to verify. She answered her mother, "Defense delayed. I am still here." Then she stood. At 9:27, Oren opened the official dissertation checklist in the review room. Morrowind sat at the head of the table. Hailworth sat opposite Solano. Soraya took the remaining chair. Oren moved through the record. Final dissertation submitted on time. Replication materials received. Required data approval complete. Publication permission complete. Co-author declaration complete. Hailworth interrupted. "We know forms exist." Morrowind looked at him. "We are establishing whether the concern you used to stop this defense had already been answered in the file." Oren continued. "External contribution letter, signed and submitted with the dissertation packet." Hailworth looked at the tablet. "Who signed it?" Oren opened the attachment. The name appeared first on his screen. Hailworth could not see it yet. Solano saw Oren's expression change. Morrowind noticed too. "Read the author and contribution record into the review." Oren turned the tablet toward the center of the table, and for the first time that morning, Cedric Hailworth stopped talking. The quiet endurance and hidden life. The name on Oren Belcastle's screen was Dr. Astrid Wexman. Cedric Hailworth stared at it. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Then he leaned back. A famous name does not answer an authorship concern. Dean Helena Morrowind looked at him. No, a properly filed contribution record answers an authorship concern. Hailworth recovered quickly, only if the record is accurate. Soraya Mensah watched the change. Minutes earlier, outside help had been proof that she did not belong in the room. Now that the outside scholar was someone Hailworth respected, the same help required careful interpretation. Morrowind turned to Oren. "Verify the submission record, publication status, and signature before we use the letter." The defense remained suspended. The name had changed the room. It had not restored Soraya's mourning. At 9:42, Oren and Leatrice Wynne moved to the graduate office to verify the dissertation packet and replication archive. Morrowind separated Soraya and Hailworth while the review continued. Professor Mirek Solano walked Soraya to an empty seminar room. "You knew this could happen?" "I knew he disliked the project. I did not expect him to question whether I wrote it." "You should call Wexman." "Not yet." "Why?" "Because I filed the documents." Solano frowned. "If Aldenbrook only believes them after a Nobel Laureate personally appears," Soraya said, "then the process has already failed." Solano sat across from her. "You are risking the schedule." No. Hailworth risked it when he made an accusation without reading the file. At 10:11, Soraya went to the graduate library. The research that had brought her to that morning began in Riverbend Courts, less than 2 miles from the Evers River. Soraya was 14 when a hurricane flooded the ground floor apartments. The water left after days. The displacement lasted years. One neighbor waited too long for assistance and fell behind on rent. Another returned to a lease renewal she could not afford. An investor bought damaged units, renovated them, and raised prices. Children disappeared from Soraya's school roster, one family at a time. The city eventually called the neighborhood recovered because the buildings were occupied again. Soraya asked her mother how a place could recover after so many of the people who made it a community were gone. Abina Mensah had spent weeks at the public library, helping residents print aid forms after they lost documents, computers, and internet access. She told her daughter, "The storm puts water in the house. The system decides who can afford to come back." Years later, Soraya wrote that sentence inside her first research notebook. Not as an answer, as a question. What part of displacement came from the disaster itself, and what part came from the institutions that followed it? At Aldenbrook, that question made some professors uncomfortable. Hailworth was one of them. During Soraya's second year, she presented an early model linking post-disaster rent growth to insurance gaps and delayed relief. Hailworth listened, then said, "You are treating policy failure as an economic mechanism because you began with the answer you wanted." Soraya asked, "Which identification problem concerns you?" "The framing." "What about it?" "It assumes institutions produce harm." "They can. I am trying to measure when they do." Hailworth called the project premature. Soraya went back to the data. The first model looked impressive. It was also wrong. It performed well in cities with clean administrative records and poorly where eviction data were incomplete. For months, Soraya tried to repair it. One night she called her mother. "Maybe I forced the numbers to follow the story." Abina asked, "Did you?" "I do not know." "Then find out." The next morning, Soraya removed 2 assumptions she badly wanted to be true. Performance fell. It hurt. It also showed her what needed rebuilding. The model became a sequence instead of a slogan. Physical shock, insurance response, credit strain, rental pressure, eviction risk, investor entry, household exit. That was the version Soraya presented 2 years later at the Calver Urban Economics Workshop. The room held fewer than 40 people. Most left after the session. One older woman remained in the last row. Soraya recognized her when she approached. Astrid Wexman had won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for work on institutional behavior during crisis and market transition. Soraya had cited her throughout the dissertation. Wexman pointed at one slide. "Why do you call this a disaster model?" "The physical event starts the sequence." "Physically, yes, but your strongest result is what happens after." Soraya waited. Similar damage produces different displacement where renter protection, insurance, credit, and relief systems differ. "Yes." "Then you are measuring the distance between a natural shock and an institutional shock." Soraya looked at the slide. "An institutional cascade." Wexman smiled. "Now you have the theory." The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Soraya expected never to hear from her again. 3 days later, an email arrived. Subject: Your displacement model. Wexman wrote that the project should not become less relevant to look more academic. It needed stronger causal tests and a more disciplined account of how institutions amplified or interrupted market pressure. She ended with one challenge: make the model survive criticism from people who dislike its implications. Soraya printed the email. The folded page still lived inside her old notebook. At 11:16 Tuesday morning, while Aldenbrook verified her authorship file, Soraya opened that notebook in the library. Wexman's mentorship had never looked glamorous. Draft, comment, rewrite, new test. Another rejection of a weak claim. On one call, Wexman stopped Soraya for describing a correlation as a mechanism. You cannot demand rigor from institutions and become careless with it yourself. Soraya was angry for an hour. Then she rewrote 20 pages. That was what Hailworth had misunderstood about the chapter he called too polished. Its polish did not mean Soraya had vanished from the work. It meant the work had survived being challenged. At 11:38, Leatrice texted, "Journal record verified. Oren is checking the signed contribution statement against the original submission receipt." Soraya answered, "Keep everything in the review channel," Leatrice replied. "I know." Then, "For the record, I am furious." Soraya almost smiled. 8 months before the defense, Wexman had proposed turning the theoretical chapter into a joint article. Soraya resisted. "I do not want people assuming you wrote the important part." Wexman answered, "Then make the contribution statement exact. I mean the perception. You cannot manage every lazy reader." The final article separated their work clearly. Soraya led the research question, data construction, empirical design, model development, robustness analysis, and policy application. Wexman strengthened the institutional theory and international literature. Both revised the article. Both signed the contribution statement. When the paper was accepted, Aldenbrook approved it for use in a dissertation by publication. Soraya filed every disclosure the university required. She had not hidden Wexman. Hailworth had not read the page. At 12:05, Solano found Soraya in the library. "Morrowind wants everyone back at 12:30. Is the file verified?" The journal record matches. The submission timestamps match. Oren is waiting for confirmation from Wexman's institutional address. "That is reasonable." Solano studied her. "You look calm." "I am not." Her hand trembled slightly against the notebook. "I am trying not to let him decide what I look like while he is wrong about me." Solano sat beside her. "I should have pushed harder before today." Soraya turned. "When?" "The committee selection. You told me he was difficult." "I called him difficult because calling him biased would have required a fight I did not want." The admission landed quietly. "I watched him treat your work as advocacy in ways he did not apply to other candidates. I told myself your evidence was strong enough to survive him." Soraya looked at him. Strong work should survive criticism. It should not have to survive an examiner refusing to read. Solano nodded. "When the record opens," she said, "do not speak before it does." "All right." She did not need rescue. She needed witnesses who would stop translating what happened into something easier to tolerate. At 12:33, the preliminary review resumed. Morrowind looked at the committee. "The external examiner can return tomorrow morning if necessary. The defense remains on hold only until this integrity question is resolved." Hailworth objected. "So we reorganize a committee because a celebrity signed a letter?" "We reorganize it because you raised a formal concern 10 minutes before a scheduled defense. The name is distorting everyone's judgment." Soraya looked at him. "It did not distort yours when you did not know it." Oren reported the facts. The dissertation packet had been submitted 23 days earlier. The co-author declaration, publication clearance, and contribution letter were included in that submission. The journal record was verified. The published author list included Soraya Mensa and Astrid Wexman. Hailworth shifted. "Published co-authorship does not prove who produced the dissertation chapter." "Correct," Morrowind said. "That is why we are reviewing the contribution statement." Oren continued. "The filed letter matches the document received during publication clearance." Hailworth said, "A signed letter can still exaggerate a student's role." Morrowind looked at him. "Do you have evidence that this one does?" "No." "Then stop converting possibilities into findings." The room tightened. Hailworth changed direction. "I want the replication archive independently examined before any defense occurs." Soraya understood immediately. The thesis had been unserious. Then the theory did not sound like her. Then disclosure was insufficient. Now the model history itself was suspect. Morrowind asked, "What specific anomaly have you identified in the archive?" "I have not inspected it." "Then on what basis are you requesting a misconduct examination?" "Given the external involvement, caution is appropriate." Soraya spoke. "The external involvement was disclosed before you made the accusation." Hailworth turned toward her. "You are determined to make this personal." "No, I am trying to make it specific." She placed her old notebook on the table. "If you want to test whether I understand the work, hold the defense and ask me the questions. If you want to allege misconduct, identify evidence of misconduct." Morrowind made the decision. The defense would be rescheduled for 9 the next morning, so the full committee and external examiner could remain intact. Oren would complete document authentication. Leatrice would provide the existing replication archive through the graduate office. No new integrity investigation would open without a defined irregularity. Hailworth remained an examiner for the moment, but Morrowind added one condition. Any further allegation must identify the evidence supporting it. His authority had not disappeared. It had acquired a boundary. At 1:26, Soraya left Aldenbrook. Her defense had moved 24 hours. Her postdoctoral deadline remained possible. Barely. She called her mother from the steps. They moved it to tomorrow. "Are you going back?" "Yes." "Good. You are not going to ask what happened. You will tell me when you are ready." Before Soraya ended the call, another email appeared. Sender, Office of Astrid Wexman. Subject, Aldenbrook verification request. Soraya did not open it. Oren had asked Wexman to authenticate the contribution letter through the official process. That was where the answer belonged. Inside the economics building, Cedric Hailworth received the same procedural notification. Dr. Astrid Wexman had responded, and she had asked for her verification to be entered into the committee record in full. The escalation and abuse of power. At 1:41 Tuesday afternoon, Oren Belcastle received Astrid Wexman's verification from her university account. Dean Helena Morrowind reopened the review room. Cedric Hailworth arrived carrying a written request to postpone Soraya Mensah's defense indefinitely. Oren had not yet read Wexman's statement aloud. Hailworth was already asking for another delay. "I want an independent inquiry into the intellectual origin of Chapter 3. Morrowind looked at him. "Based on what new evidence?" "The candidate has a Nobel Laureate embedded in the project. That changes the independence question." Soraya sat across from him. "The collaboration was disclosed 23 days ago." "A disclosure does not prove the work is yours. It proves I did not hide the collaboration." Morrowind placed Hailworth's request beside the incident note from the hallway. "We will read the verified record first." Oren opened Wexman's response. She confirmed that she had co-authored the published article used as Chapter 3. She confirmed the contribution statement was authentic. Soraya developed the research question, assembled the city data, built the empirical model, designed the primary tests, completed the robustness work, and led the policy analysis. Wexman contributed to institutional theory, international literature, and revision of the conceptual framework. Both authors approved the final article. Hailworth waited until Oren finished. "That is her account." Morrowind asked, "Do you have evidence that it is false?" "No." "Then what are you alleging?" "A co-author has an interest in validating her own publication, which is why the journal record and university submission record are being verified separately." Hailworth leaned back. "You are letting prestige intimidate the process." Soraya almost answered. She stopped. The important question was no longer whether Hailworth respected Wexman. It was whether the record survived without requiring his respect. At 2:06, Oren confirmed the published article listed Soraya first and Wexman second. The publication clearance had been approved before the final dissertation packet was accepted. Morrowind looked at Hailworth. "The allegation of undisclosed co-authorship has no factual basis." "I did not use the word hidden." Oren opened the incident note. "Potential undisclosed contribution." Hailworth's jaw tightened. That was the administrative category you demanded. You selected it after I asked you to identify the concern. I was forced into language that did not capture the academic issue. Morrowind wrote something down. When process had supported his authority, Hailworth called it rigor. Now that it preserved his own words, he called it inadequate. At 2:23, Astrid Wexman joined by secure video. Morrowind began. We need authorship and contribution facts, not an evaluation of Professor Hailworth. Understood. She confirmed that Soraya had built the displacement model before they met. Wexman had not assembled the data, written the model code, or designed the original empirical strategy. She had contributed substantially to the theory. Hailworth moved forward. Then the chapter is not independent. Wexman looked at him. It is co-authored. Those are not synonyms. You provided the theoretical framework. I helped develop it. That is the most sophisticated part of the dissertation. No, it is the part you happen to value most. The room went still. Wexman continued. The theory matters because Soraya's empirical work gave it something new to explain. I did not arrive with a framework and hire a student to decorate it with data. She arrived with a pattern the existing literature did not explain well enough. Hailworth said, "The prose exceeds the theoretical maturity I have observed from the candidate." Then examine her. I have. No, you tried to stop the examination. Morrowind brought the conversation back to verification. Wexman restated the contribution split and confirmed the article had gone through peer review. Before leaving the call, she added one fact. If Chapter 3 were removed, Soraya's independent model and empirical contribution would still exist throughout the dissertation. The call ended at 2:43. Soraya looked at the blue dissertation. For 2 years, she had feared Wexman's name might become a shortcut people used to explain away her ability. Now Hailworth was doing exactly that. Before he knew the name, the chapter was too sophisticated to be Soraya's. After he knew the name, Wexman's involvement became the reason Soraya was not independent. The conclusion stayed fixed, only the justification moved. Morrowind turned to Hailworth. Your original integrity concern is resolved. I disagree. You may disagree with the scholarship. There is no evidence of undisclosed authorship. I want the replication materials examined. Soraya spoke. If there is an irregularity, identify it. Hailworth looked at her. You are very eager to control the scope. No, I am asking you to define it. Morrowind decided the existing replication archive could be checked because it was already part of the dissertation record. No new misconduct investigation would open without a specific irregularity. Leatrice Wynne entered with repository access information. Oren opened the copy deposited with graduate studies. The history began years before Wexman met Soraya. Early versions failed. One overpredicted displacement where eviction data were incomplete. Another treated insurance access too simply. Later versions added household credit pressure, and the sequence Soraya eventually called an institutional cascade. The files were not proof because they were numerous. They mattered because earlier annual progress reviews referenced the same model versions before Soraya ever met Wexman. Leatrice pointed to the repository history. Soraya wrote the primary model files. I reviewed statistical tests and replication structure. Hailworth asked, can repository history be manipulated? Local files can be edited, Leatrice said. This is the university repository. The older versions were also referenced in progress reviews. Oren confirmed the dates. The two main mechanisms now said the same thing from different directions. The official co-author record showed Wexman's contribution had been disclosed. The research history showed Soraya's model existed long before that collaboration. At 3:21, Hailworth stopped arguing about ghostwriting. He changed the accusation. Even if the model is hers, the dissertation overstates her independent theoretical contribution. Solano answered, that is a defense question. It is a degree question. Then ask it in the defense. Hailworth turned to Morrowind. If this proceeds tomorrow, my objection will be attached to the committee record. It will be preserved. Good. He opened the memorandum he had brought with him. The first paragraph said he had identified irregularities in the intellectual presentation of Chapter 3. The second said Soraya had presented the chapter as independent scholarship until challenged before the defense. Oren looked up. That sentence conflicts with the submission record. Hailworth frowned. How? The dissertation marked the chapter as co-authored when it was submitted. The publication clearance did too. I mean, she did not personally call my attention to it. That is not what the sentence says. Hailworth closed the document. You are an academic secretary, Mr. Belcastle. Do not edit my judgment. I am not. I am identifying a factual conflict. Morrowind held out her hand. Give me the memorandum. Hailworth passed it to her. If you file this, the factual wording should be corrected. I will file my assessment as written. Then it will be preserved beside the disclosure record. Fine. Hailworth was no longer trying only to defend an academic objection. He was trying to preserve a version of events in which stopping Soraya had been justified. At 3:50, Morrowind lifted the academic integrity hold. The defense remained scheduled for 9 the next morning. The external examiner confirmed availability. Soraya's dissertation would be evaluated under Aldenbrook's existing dissertation by publication rules. Hailworth remained on the committee for the moment, because removing an examiner required a separate conflict determination. But Morrowind placed his memorandum under administrative review. Professor Hailworth, do not contact Soraya outside scheduled committee communication about this dispute. His expression changed. You think I am going to intimidate her? I am drawing a boundary while I review what happened. This is absurd. It is written. Soraya heard the difference. The previous morning, Hailworth's judgment had been treated as enough to delay her. Now his conduct had become part of the record. He still had power. He no longer had unobserved power. At 4:14, Soraya returned to the graduate library. The integrity hold was gone. She still did not feel safe. If Hailworth remained on the committee, he could question every assumption and vote against the dissertation. He could tell colleagues that Aldenbrook had lowered its standards because a famous scholar intervened. Soraya opened her old notebook. Wexman's printed email remained folded between 2 pages. Make the model survive criticism from people who dislike its implications. Soraya had spent 2 years treating that as a technical challenge. Now she understood the harder version. The work also had to survive a person who disliked what her authority represented. Her phone rang. Astrid Wexman. You should be preparing, Wexman said. I am. You do not sound like it. Soraya looked through the library window. Everyone looked at me differently when your name appeared. Of course they did. I hate that. So do I. If your name had not been there, he would have kept saying I could not have written it. Probably. Then what did I prove? You did not prove anything by knowing me. Soraya stayed quiet. My name forced them to open a record they should have read without it. Your record is what matters after the door opens. Tomorrow he is going to say the theory is yours. Then answer the theory. And if he still votes no, then the committee owns its decision. Soraya touched the bent corner of the dissertation. The day before, she had wanted to leave Aldenbrook. Now leaving would allow Hailworth's accusation to become the last public description of 6 years of work. I am going back. I assumed you were. At 4:48, Solano received a request from Morrowind. She wanted any previous written concerns he had raised about Hailworth's treatment of Soraya. There were none. He had disagreed with Hailworth in meetings. He had defended Soraya privately. He had never created a formal record. That absence forced him to face what his caution had protected. He searched his old calendar. One faculty meeting from 11 months earlier stood out. Soraya's city partnership had been discussed. Hailworth had called the department's direction social justice branding. Solano remembered who had been standing outside the open door. Leatrice. At 5:12, he called her. I need to ask what you heard that day. I remember. Would you tell Morrowind? Leatrice was quiet. "Why did nobody ask me then?" Solano had no good answer. "Because I should have pushed harder." Leatrice agreed to describe only what she had personally heard, no motives, no guesses. At 5:36, Hailworth filed his memorandum without changing the disputed sentence. He added a new claim. Soraya's insistence on formal procedure, he wrote, had created an adversarial atmosphere and raised concerns about her professional judgment. Morrowind read the line twice. Soraya had asked an examiner to identify evidence behind an authorship allegation. Hailworth had turned that request into another criticism of the candidate. Morrowind sent Orin one instruction: preserve the original memorandum and all revisions. Then she requested a limited search of earlier graduate cases in which Hailworth had raised concerns about candidate voice, theoretical fit, activism, or authorship credibility. The first archived file appeared before 6. Candidate: Vivica St. Clair. Examiner: Cedric Hailworth. One comment had been entered 4 years earlier. The theoretical section is unusually polished relative to the candidate's prior work. Morrowind stared at the sentence. Tomorrow was no longer only about whether Soraya could defend her dissertation. It was becoming a question of how many students Cedric Hailworth had taught Aldenbrook to doubt in exactly the same way. The evidence, pattern, and authority shift. At 7:40 Wednesday morning, Dean Helena Morrowind opened the first archived file involving Cedric Hailworth. It belonged to Vivica St. Clair. 4 years earlier, Vivica had proposed a dissertation on municipal debt and neighborhood inequality. Hailworth had described it as too personally invested and insufficiently detached. Then Morrowind found a sentence that echoed Soraya Mensah's case. The theoretical section is unusually polished relative to the candidate's prior work. Vivica changed topics before the next progress review. Her rating improved. Her funding ended months later. The sequence did not prove discrimination. It proved that Hailworth's judgment had consequences. Orin Belcastle brought 3 more records with similar concerns about advocacy, unusual polish, and whether work still sounded like the candidate. Different years. Similar language. Morrowind said, "Pull the full records. We compare outcomes. We do not guess motive." At 8:05, Soraya entered Aldenbrook carrying the same blue dissertation and old notebook. Her defense was still scheduled for 9. Leatrice Wynne met her near the graduate office. "Morrowind has not released the room." "Hailworth?" "I do not know." Soraya looked at the electronic board. Her name was still there. She had spent the night preparing to defend the model. Now she was waiting again, because the examiner who accused her had become part of the record himself. Leatrice said, "I gave Morrowind the statement about that faculty meeting." "Only what you heard?" "Only what I heard." Soraya nodded. If Hailworth was going to be judged, she wanted evidence to speak before anger did. At 8:16, Hailworth sent Morrowind another memorandum. He asked to postpone the defense again. The reason had changed. He no longer alleged undisclosed authorship. He argued that Soraya's conduct during the review had created an adversarial atmosphere that made impartial examination difficult. Morrowind placed the memo beside the one he filed the previous afternoon. That document said Soraya's insistence on formal procedure raised concerns about professional judgment. Soraya had asked him to identify evidence behind an accusation. He had turned the request itself into another reason to question her. Morrowind called him. "Do not contact the committee about another postponement until I finish the examiner conflict review. You are restricting my academic role because a candidate challenged me. I am separating your role as examiner from your role in this dispute." I identified a scholarly concern. The undisclosed contribution concern was disproved. The administrative wording did not capture the real issue. You filed the wording. Hailworth paused. Forms are becoming more important than expertise. They matter when expertise is used to stop a defense. At 8:34, Professor Mirek Solano arrived. Morrowind showed him the earlier files. "Did you know Cedric used language like this?" "Some of it." Did you report concerns? No. Why? Solano looked toward the closed seminar room. Because every incident could be explained separately. He was senior. He was known as demanding. I told myself Soraya's work was strong enough to survive him. Did that protect her? No. He had defended Soraya privately while avoiding a faculty fight. That choice had been safer for him than for her. Solano confirmed the meeting Leatrice had overheard 11 months earlier. After Soraya's city partnership was discussed, Hailworth criticized the department for confusing scholarship with social justice branding. Leatrice gave the same account and remembered him saying some scholars turn personal pain into theory. Did he say Soraya's name? Morrowind asked. No. Then that stays clear in the record. Fact before inference. At 8:53, the defense room remained closed. Soraya sat beneath the electronic board. Her mother called. Still waiting, Soraya said. Do you want me to come? No. Then be ready. Before ending the call, Abina Mensa added, do not let waiting turn into leaving. Soraya looked at the bent corner of the dissertation. I will not. At 9:11, Vivica St. Clair joined Morrowind by secure video. She was now a public finance policy analyst. Morrowind explained that a current examiner conflict had raised questions about earlier graduate evaluations. Vivica was not required to participate. Is this about Professor Hailworth? Yes. Vivica went quiet. Then she said, I still have the folder. She described the dissertation she had wanted to write about municipal debt, austerity, and unequal public service cuts. Professor Hailworth said I was too close to the subject. Did he order you to abandon it? No. Did he threaten your funding? No. The distinction mattered. Vivica continued. My progress review depended partly on his evaluation. I changed topics because I needed to pass. Her rating improved afterward. Morrowind asked whether race affected Hailworth's judgment. I cannot prove what was in his head. I can prove he treated my connection to the subject as evidence that I lacked distance. Vivica looked into the camera. That is why I never complained. Every piece was small enough for someone to explain away. Morrowind ended the call with enough information for the immediate question. Not enough to decide Hailworth's career. Those were different standards. At 9:40, Hailworth entered the review room with Solano and Oren. Soraya remained outside. Morrowind placed 3 issues before him. He tried to halt a defense over a contribution that had already been disclosed. He then filed a memorandum contradicting the submission record, and while still serving as examiner, he treated Soraya's request for evidence as a problem with professional judgment. Hailworth listened. Then he said, You are turning academic disagreement into misconduct. No, I am deciding whether you can remain impartial in this defense. I can. Why? I have examined doctoral candidates for 27 years. Experience does not remove conflict. You are allowing a candidate to remove an examiner because she dislikes criticism. Soraya did not request your removal. That stopped him. I initiated this review, Morrowind said. Hailworth looked at Solano. You wanted me off this committee. No. Solano held his gaze. I wanted to believe your treatment of Soraya was only severe criticism. I should have challenged that assumption earlier. Hailworth gave a bitter laugh. Now everyone has courage because Astrid Wexman appeared. Solano answered. Her name made us read a file we should have read first. At 10:03, Morrowind issued the conflict determination. Cedric Hailworth was removed from Soraya Mensa's dissertation committee for the current defense. He was not fired. He was not declared guilty of discrimination. He lost one specific authority because his own conduct had made his impartiality reasonably questionable. Hailworth read the decision. This damages my reputation before any investigation. The decision says exactly what it is and what it is not. You are rewarding a student for making accusations. Morrowind looked at him. The first accusation came from you. Orrin entered the decision into the graduate record. The procedure Hailworth had used to question Soraya's authorship now documented why he could no longer judge her degree. At 10:14, Morrowind met Soraya outside. "Professor Hailworth will not examine you." Soraya did not smile. "What happens now?" "We are contacting the approved alternate examiner. The external examiner can remain through early afternoon." "And the integrity hold?" "Closed." The review of Hailworth. Separate. A preliminary review opens today. Because of what happened to me? Because your case gives us reason to ask whether it happened in other forms before. At 10:27, the approved alternate examiner confirmed availability for 11:15. The defense would begin at 11:30. Hailworth received the same notice. 5 minutes later, he sent a message to the department faculty list. He wrote that graduate administration had removed him after extraordinary outside pressures surrounding a candidate whose dissertation benefited from prestigious external intervention. He did not name Wexman. He did not need to. The implication was clear. Aldenbrook had lowered standards because a Nobel Laureate was involved. Morrowind read the email. Hailworth had been told not to use committee communication to continue the dispute. Now, after losing examiner authority, he had pushed his version to the wider department. She forwarded the message into the preliminary review. At 10:45, Morrowind imposed a temporary graduate supervision restriction pending formal review. Hailworth would not chair new dissertation committees or make sole progress recommendations affecting doctoral funding. His current students would receive an additional reviewer on high-stakes decisions. His faculty appointment remained unchanged. He called immediately. "This is retaliation. It is an interim risk measure. I have never retaliated against a student." Then the review will test that statement. At 10:56, Orrin received a new message from Vivica. She had found the folder. Attached was a committee response from the semester she changed dissertation topics. One sentence matched the problem now under review. The prose displays a level of theoretical polish not consistently demonstrated by the candidate in seminar settings. Vivica's old reply asked what specific theoretical error the statement identified. The file contained no written answer. This did not prove Soraya's work again. That question was already settled. It increased the scope. Morrowind formally expanded the preliminary review to earlier cases involving candidate voice, unusual polish, theoretical fit, and community-based research. The university would compare records and outcomes before reaching conclusions. At 11:06, Solano asked Morrowind to add a statement of his own. "I need the record to show that I saw warning signs and did not create a formal record." Why? Because if this review only asks what Cedric did, the department learns nothing about how the rest of us allowed it. Morrowind wrote it down. Hailworth's authority had mattered. So had the silence around it. Before the defense, Morrowind issued temporary safeguards. An examiner seeking an integrity hold had to name the alleged violation and evidence. Required co-author disclosures had to be confirmed as available before a defense. Vague concerns about voice, polish, seriousness, or fit could not trigger punishment without a defined academic or integrity issue. The measures still required faculty review. They could not return Soraya's lost day. They could stop another student from losing one the same way. At 11:26, Orrin reopened the seminar room. The electronic board changed. Soraya Mensa, dissertation defense. New start time, 11:30. Leatrice stood beside her. "You ready?" Soraya looked at the bent blue cover. "No." Leatrice gave a small smile. "Good." Soraya placed the old notebook on top of the dissertation. Astrid Wexman's name had forced Aldenbrook to read what was already in its own system. The contribution record established the collaboration. The research history established Soraya's work. The earlier files had now changed the question from one thesis to the authority Hailworth had exercised for years. But none of that could award Soraya a doctorate. The committee still had to test the work. At 11:29, Soraya walked into the seminar room. Cedric Hailworth's chair was gone. Astrid Wexman was not on the screen. Only the committee, an independent examiner, 6 years of research, and the first slide waited for her. Soraya set the notebook beside the blue dissertation. Then she looked at the room. "I am ready." The Systematic Reckoning, Legacy, and Moral Aftermath. At 11:30 Wednesday morning, Soraya Mensah began the defense Cedric Hailworth had tried to stop. She did not begin with him. She began with the model. Her first slide compared two neighborhoods struck by storms of similar physical severity. One recovered most of its renters within a year. The other lost nearly a third. "The damage does not explain the difference by itself," Soraya said. She moved through the sequence she had spent 6 years building: insurance gaps, delayed assistance, credit stress, rent increases, eviction filings, investor purchases, household exit. The independent examiner challenged the model's limits. 42 cities do not represent every housing market. "They do not," Soraya said. "The framework identifies elevated risk. It does not produce one universal answer for every city." She showed where performance weakened: incomplete eviction records, informal housing, slow relief data. She did not hide the failures. Then the examiner moved to Chapter 3. Explain the institutional theory without relying on Dr. Wexman's contribution statement. Soraya closed the presentation view. She explained how similar physical shocks could produce different housing outcomes because they entered different systems of insurance, credit, tenant protection, relief, and ownership. So the cascade is not a claim that markets are artificial. It is a claim that markets transmit shocks through institutions, and institutions can amplify or interrupt them. What did Wexman add? She strengthened the theoretical structure and international literature. What existed before her? The research question, city data, empirical design, model, and the sequence the theory had to explain. The examiner continued. Soraya answered. No Nobel Laureate sat beside her. No administrator answered for her. At 12:47, the committee asked Soraya to wait outside. Leatrice Wynne sat near the same hallway table where Hailworth had dropped the blue dissertation the day before. "How bad?" Leatrice asked. "I do not know." Soraya ran a thumb over the bent corner of the cover. At 1:06, the door opened. The committee chair called her back. "The dissertation passes, subject to minor revisions." Soraya stayed still. Minor? Clarify two limitations and strengthen the discussion of delayed relief data. The independent examiner added, "The work is original and defensible on its own record." That was the sentence Soraya needed. Defensible. Not rescued, not validated by a famous name. Tested. Professor Mirek Solano held out his hand. "Congratulations, Dr. Mensah." Soraya shook it. Outside, she called her mother. Abina Mensah answered immediately. "Well?" "It passed." A pause, then, "Good." Soraya laughed. "That is all? You called me for the truth, not a parade." Soraya leaned against the wall. "It passed." "I heard you." 3 days later, Hailworth asked to speak with Soraya. In Morrowind's office, while the review remained active, his graduate supervision restrictions were still temporary. "If I had known Dr. Wexman was your co-author," he said, "I would have chosen different language." Soraya looked at him. "That is why the apology fails. I am acknowledging I spoke too strongly. You are saying the work deserved respect because you learned who stood beside it. Her involvement was relevant. It was disclosed. You did not read it." Hailworth shifted. "I believed I was protecting standards." Soraya did not argue about what he believed. "If her name had not been there, you still would have had my model history, progress reviews, contribution statement, and answers. Those should have been enough. This is becoming punitive." "No, Punitive would be pretending the problem was that you did not recognize the right famous person. Soraya stood and left. She did not need another apology. She needed the process to change. 5 weeks later, Aldenbrook completed the first stage of its graduate review. The findings were narrower than rumor and more serious than Hailworth wanted. The university did not conclude that every negative evaluation he had written was biased. Several earlier academic criticisms were supported by identifiable methodological problems. But reviewers found 4 cases in which Hailworth had used concerns about candidate voice, unusual polish, insufficient distance, or activism to support adverse graduate recommendations without identifying a corresponding integrity violation or specific theoretical error. Vivica St. Clair's case was among them. Her funding loss could not simply be reversed years later. Aldenbrook instead attached the review findings to her academic record and offered independent support for publication of the municipal debt research she had abandoned during her doctorate. Vivica read the notice in her office. "It does not give the years back," she told Morrowind. "No. But now the record does not say I simply failed." "No." Vivica signed the release, allowing her case to inform the policy review. For Hailworth, the consequence came through the same graduate system in which he had exercised authority. His temporary restrictions became a 2-year removal from dissertation examination, graduate admissions, and sole doctoral progress decisions. He retained his faculty appointment and undergraduate teaching while completing the formal conduct process and a supervised return plan. His eligibility for department leadership was suspended during that period. Hailworth appealed part of the decision. The appeal was recorded. It did not suspend the safeguards. The university also examined its own role. Solano gave a formal statement admitting that he had treated unequal scrutiny as a personality conflict because challenging a senior professor seemed more disruptive than staying quiet. Morrowind asked him one question: who carried the cost of that quiet? Solano answered, Soraya did, and probably students before her. That admission did not absolve him. It became part of the reform. By the next academic term, Aldenbrook adopted a revised doctoral defense protocol. An examiner could no longer stop a scheduled defense on an integrity ground without naming the alleged violation and the evidence supporting it. Required co-author and publication disclosures had to be acknowledged as reviewed before a candidate entered the defense room. Words such as voice, polish, fit, seriousness, or theoretical distance could still appear in scholarly criticism, but they could not trigger punitive action unless the examiner translated them into a specific academic or integrity concern. Candidates could request an independent graduate observer where documented examiner conflict existed. High-stakes funding recommendations required more than one accountable reviewer. Soraya asked for one additional protection. If the university requires students to submit evidence, the system should show whether the people judging them actually opened it. Orrin Belcastle helped add the confirmation step. A disclosure could no longer sit quietly in the portal while a candidate suffered for an examiner's refusal to read. That was the systemic consequence Hailworth had never imagined in the hallway. He had tried to make Soraya's credibility depend on his judgment. His own conduct forced Aldenbrook to reduce how much unchecked judgment one examiner could exercise over everyone after her. Soraya's dissertation did not remain inside the university. 3 cities entered research partnerships to test the displacement framework with local data. Soraya refused requests to advertise it as a machine that could predict exactly who would lose a home. It identifies warning patterns, she told one housing office. It does not know a family's future. After a tropical storm, one partner city detected a combination of delayed assistance, rising eviction filings, and rapid investor purchases in several renter districts. Officials expanded rental assistance and tenant outreach before the annual eviction peak. Filings later came in below the city's baseline projection. Soraya refused to call that proof that her model had saved families. Local organizations had acted. Policy had changed. People had made decisions the model could never see. The research had done something more modest and more useful. It made the warning harder to ignore. 1 year after the defense, Soraya returned to Aldenbrook for a conference on climate displacement economics. This was the single place where all the pieces finally met. Leatrice was now co-author on Soraya's next paper, refining the framework for cities with incomplete administrative data. Astrid Wexman sat in the front row. Soraya's mother sat 2 seats away. On the screen were results from the city pilots, including failures. One city produced unstable estimates because informal rental turnover was poorly measured. Another showed that relief speed mattered less than expected, where tenant protections were already strong. The framework had changed because reality had challenged it. Afterward, a doctoral student asked Soraya how research could stay close to communities without losing rigor. Soraya looked at the question for a moment. Distance is useful when it stops us from forcing evidence to say what we want. It becomes dangerous when we use distance as an excuse not to see what the evidence is measuring. In the hallway after the session, Wexman touched the old notebook under Soraya's arm. "You still carry that?" "Yes." Inside it remained the sentence Abina had given her when she was 14. "The storm puts water in the house. The system decides who can afford to come back." Soraya had turned that sentence into a question, then into data, then into a framework cities could test. She looked through the seminar room door. A new notice hung beside it. Evidence before adverse action. Required disclosures must be reviewed before examination. Wexman said quietly, "A famous name can open a door." Soraya looked at her mother, then at the students leaving the room. "But the work has to keep you there." Wexman smiled. "Exactly." Cedric Hailworth had believed rigor meant deciding who sounded capable before fully reading what they had done. Soraya's work survived a harder standard. It survived disclosure, replication, questions, failure, revision, and use outside the university. The most important change was not that Aldenbrook finally believed Soraya Mensah. It was that the next scholar would have a better chance of being read before needing someone famous to make the institution pay attention. Soraya closed the notebook. The warning her mother gave her years ago no longer lived only on one folded page. Now, the system had to read the signals too.